By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, some 63 years after her accession, Britain had changed beyond recognition. The Industrial Revolution had ushered in huge social and political change. The British Empire had expanded to embrace over a quarter of the world's population, and the country had become arguably the most powerful on the planet. But for the young princes, growing up in relative seclusion on the Sandringham estate just over 100 miles north of London, such astonishing facts gave no protection against the privations of an upper-class upbringing. Like many children of the aristocracy brought up in the country, their early years were spent in the nursery, where life was far from idyllic.
The nurses really took it out a bit on poor little Bertie. And there's the story that the reason why he had all these digestive problems later was because this sadistic nurse would give him his bottle in some bouncing barouche every day.
There's an awful story with the Duke of Windsor as a little boy being pinched by the nanny so that when he came in for his statutory, whatever it was, 45 minutes with his parents, that he would be crying and make a bad impression and perhaps be sent away.
The accession of their grandfather and his coronation as King Edward VII in August 1902 marked a significant change in the lives of the two princes. The days of the childhood nursery were replaced by the unfamiliar routine of school lessons, as ordered by their father, himself a strict disciplinarian.
It seems that George V once said that he had been frightened of his father and he was determined that his children should be frightened of him. Whether he said it or not, they certainly were frightened of him.
By then, the contrast between the boy's character and temperament had begun to emerge. Prince Edward, now second in line to the throne, was good-looking, charming, and fun. His brother Albert was shy and withdrawn. Worse still, he had developed a stammer that would haunt him all his life. Life in the classroom and at the hands of their stern father was tough for the princes. But there were appealing diversions. When their grandfather, King Edward VII, arrived for the shooting season or Christmas, Sandringham was a happy place.
Edward and Alexandra were very loving grandparents, particularly Alexandra. She really loved them, and she made it wonderful for them at Sandringham with horses and dogs and that. Perhaps they were a bit too loving, and the comparison with the father, who was not loving, was rather a strong one.
Edward VII's reign was brief. He died in 1910.
The new king is here seen walking behind the gun carriage, accompanied by his cousin, the German Emperor, the Prince of Wales, then a boy of 16, and the Duke of Connaught.
By this time, Prince Edward and Prince Albert had left the confines of Sandringham and were now cadets at the Royal Naval College. While Prince Edward appeared keen and proved popular, Prince Albert gained an unwarranted reputation for stupidity, due in part to the inhibition his stammer produced in him.
If you try to manage your stammer, for example, by not communicating very well, but not communicating at all, it becomes very difficult to bring across who you are, what you know, what you wish for. You suddenly become this silent person that nobody really knows very well. And if you can't communicate who you are, people will make assumptions. And very often one of the assumptions are that you're not very bright.
Now their father was king, Prince Edward, as the direct heir to George V, automatically assumed the title Prince of Wales.
A sweltering summer day, he afterwards recalled, with 10,000 people looking on.
For Prince Albert, Edward's elevated status only exacerbated his own feelings of inferiority, feelings that, despite his later success, never really left him. The event that brought radical changes to the lives of both princes and for all the peoples of Europe was the Great War, which began in 1914. In August that year, Germany declared war on Russia, France and Belgium. In response, the British declared war on Germany, then led by Queen Victoria's grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II.
The Kaiser, her grandson, always said that if she had survived longer, maybe the European War, the Great War, would have been averted, and that's possibly true. Because certainly the fact that Edward VII, Victoria's son, and the Kaiser disliked each other a lot, there's something in this.
The Prince of Wales served as a junior officer in the Grenadier Guards and was posted to France, where he was attached to the British Expeditionary Force. Much to his frustration, as heir to the throne, it was considered far too dangerous for him to serve on the front line.
Oh, to be fighting with those grand fellows, he wrote at the time.
Instead, the prince was allowed only one visit to observe the fighting. The remainder of his time was mostly spent visiting the wounded in hospital. His brother, Prince Albert, did see active service.
As an officer in HMS Collingwood, one of the ships in the battle squadron, he took part in the periodical sweeps made by the fleet into the North Sea in search of the German High Seas fleet.
In May 1916, Albert was aboard HMS Collingwood during the Battle of Jutland.
Here the British battleships are firing salvo.
Before this, however, the gastric problems that had plagued him since childhood returned. Albert was deemed a semi-invalid and had no choice but to stay away from the battlefields. He was forced instead to spend time with the King and Queen. The experience brought a positive change to the relationship between father and son, and Albert witnessed firsthand what it was to be a king during a time of war, an experience he would draw on 2 decades later. The war ended in 1918. A year earlier, King George V decided to distance the British royal family from its German heritage. He changed the family name of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the House of Windsor, after the ancient English royal fort. He also rechristened many of his relations, including the family of Prince Louis of Battenberg, who would henceforth be known by the anglicised name Mountbatten. Prince Edward, Prince of Wales, embarked on a series of royal tours of the British Empire. The first was to Canada in 1919.
Everyone wanted to shake hands with the Prince of Wales, and soon the Prince's right hand was blackened and swollen. And he wrote home that he was using his left hand, having, as he explained, temporarily retired my right hand from imperial service.
As the tours continued, the prince's popularity increased. But the king was alarmed by what he perceived as his eldest son's disregard for royal protocol and tradition. In contrast, Prince Albert, now Duke of York, continued to grow in his father's estimation. The king especially approved of his marriage to society beauty Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923.
He reckoned that the Duke of York, as he now was, had sort of upped his game and had met somebody actually extremely sensible, and the best thing he ever did was to pursue her completely. And of course she was also very strong. She wasn't a sort of nanny figure,
But of all his public duties, there was one that held a particular terror: public speaking. The Duke's first major speech was in 1925, at the closing ceremony of the Empire exhibition at Wembley in London. Due to his stammer, it was a disaster.
The experience of actually not being able to produce speech, of blocking, which is, I think, the technical term, is something that I have experienced myself. So you're completely caught in your own brain, and it's dark, and you can't get out, and you have no idea what goes on around you. So it is it's very frightening, but it's also absolutely humiliating.
By coincidence, an Australian speech therapist by the name of Lionel Logue was there in the crowd that day and heard the Duke's speech. Although Logue was said to express a professional interest, He had no idea then that the Duke would become his most famous patient. The Duke paid his first visit to Logue's consulting room in London's Harley Street on the 19th of October, 1926.
Where he was, I think, utterly innovative is he combined speech production techniques, breathing techniques, forming vowels and sounds differently, with a more psychological approach, which is, I think, a very modern thing, but was unheard of, I think, before him. You wouldn't have anyone really dealing with the underlying emotions and feelings around communication, around stammering.
Lionel Logue and the Duke met for 82 appointments between October 1926 and December 1927. After just a few sessions, the Duke wrote to his father, "I am sure I'm going to get quite all right in time, but 24 years of talking in the wrong way cannot be cured in a month."